Traveling the day after the plane crash. A journey of pure oblivion. When I was 14, I traveled to the UK from South Africa alone to spend Christmas and New Year with my godmother. She had left earlier in the year, returning to her country of birth to retire, so she could be closer to family she hadn't seen in more than 2 decades. I missed her terribly, more than I could possibly express at that age, and my parents noticed. Despite feeling nervous about putting their young teenage daughter on a long-haul flight alone, they knew it was something I desperately needed, so flights were booked and pickup times were communicated. It was 1987, and South African Airways was the second safest airline in the world. Only the Australian airline Qantas was deemed safer. An airplane going down never crossed the mind of South African travellers, and based on those statistics, there was no reason it should. The day came and I was excited. I was always a brave child, and very few things brought me feelings of fear. I had no idea that there'd been a massive South African Airways plane crash the day before, but there had. The Helderberg SAA Flight 295 had crashed into the Indian Ocean in the middle of the night in late November. The Boeing 747-200 was 9 hours into a long-haul flight from Chiang Kai-shek International Airport in Taipei to Jan Smuts International Airport in Johannesburg. The country was in shock, but none so more than the families who had lost loved ones. And, strangely enough, my parents. At 14, I was oblivious to almost everything that didn't affect me directly, as are most adolescents. The news was boring, and I never watched it. This boded well for me on that warm day in November. My parents, however, were fully aware that they were about to put their child on the same model aircraft as the downed plane a mere 24 hours after the report had come through of the crash. I had never traveled alone and was the product of sheltered parenting. I had also only been on a plane once before, flying from Durban to Cape Town with my folks for a holiday many years before, and I definitely hadn't flown overseas. In fact, I had never even left my home country before. With heavy hearts and fear coursing through their veins, my parents drove me 45 minutes to Durban International Airport to board my flight to London Heathrow Airport. I was completely oblivious to the terror they felt, and they were determined to keep me that way. "You do not tell Vanessa about the Helderberg," my mother warned my father sternly. "Okay," was all he could mutter, ashen at the thought of sending his firstborn off to England on her own. Years later, I found out that my folks had considered not letting me go, but they knew I would never have forgiven them if they'd cancelled that trip. It was 80s South Africa, and protocol dictated that as an unaccompanied minor, I had to be under the guardianship of the airline staff until delivered to the person waiting for me at my destination. After being handed over and taken to the boarding gate by my minder, my parents, along with my sister, drove out of the airport and pulled over on a side road to watch the plane take off. My father cried. He never cried. Believe it or not, this is only the beginning of the story. The flight was long, much longer than any flight from South Africa to England now. Due to sanctions placed on the country's apartheid government, South African Airways had to fly diverted routes to Europe. All South African Airways planes were not permitted to fly over Africa. Instead, they had to fly around the Horn of the continent, which meant stopping briefly in Espargos, the largest of the Cabo Verde Islands off the coast of Senegal, to refuel before the final push onto European destinations. South African Airways was on edge. The crash had rocked the airline, and they were being more cautious than ever before. As we neared Heathrow, the captain informed the passengers that there was a tremendous amount of fog over the city and that we would circle the airport until it was safe to land. There were 14 airplanes in the same rotation, all waiting for permission to approach. We circled for about 30 minutes before the announcement was made. Ladies and gentlemen, we are unable to land at Heathrow Airport due to the fog and will be diverting to Gatwick. Your family and friends will be notified of the change, and transportation will be made available to get you back to Heathrow as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Of the 14 planes circling, 2 were SAA planes. Only those 2 aircraft diverted to Gatwick. I repeat, South African Airways was on edge and unwilling to take any chances. As a minor, I was not permitted to board the bus back to Heathrow Airport, as I had to be handed over directly to the person my parents designated as my guardian at the destination, my godmother. The problem with this plan was that they weren't letting her leave Heathrow to collect me. I was left in an airport lounge to wait with an obnoxious teenage boy who happened to be the son of a famous South African television news presenter. He, too, was under the airline's guardianship, and so we waited. I don't recall how long we were left in that room, but it felt like hours. Eventually, my godmother, plus her sister and brother-in-law, who had driven her down to London from their home in Farnborough, were allowed to leave Heathrow and head to Gatwick to take ownership of me. After hours of being confined and bored, there were no cell phone or internet in those days. I was finally collected and we were soon on our way back to northeast Hampshire. Allow me to set the scene here. I was meant to call my folks as soon as I arrived at my godmother's home, which we estimated would be around midday, allowing for traffic and potential travel delays. This level of delay, however, had not been expected. Between circling Heathrow, landing at Gatwick, waiting for my family to be allowed to collect me, and then the evening traffic on the motorway back to Farnborough, I arrived exhausted but happy, just before 10 p.m. that night. This was 10 hours later than the time my parents expected me to call, on the day after the worst airplane crash in South African history. I was still oblivious. I was oblivious to the nervousness that my parents had felt sending me off in Durban. I was oblivious to the fact that they had been calling my godmother's house all day and begging for answers from her sister. I was oblivious to the fact that she, too, had no information to give them either. I was oblivious to the fact that they were at their wits' end, or that they had been walking around the house white as ghosts, and we're a pretty white family to begin with, in a daze of pure fear and adrenaline. I was completely oblivious to the terror mixed with relief in their voices, as they tried to hold back tears when I called to say I was safe and sound. All I can say is, thank God I was oblivious. Traveling the day after the worst plane crash in South Africa's history is a factoid I learned 6 weeks later, after touching back down in my homeland, to relieved hugs from my family.